The final days of Henry VIII represent a unique, pivotal moment when medieval and early modern concepts of royal power collided. On the one hand, the elaborate funeral rituals associated with proper burial and deep anxiety about succession reflected ancient traditions of royal death that had their roots in centuries past. On the other hand, detailed medical records, the legal precision of Henry's will, and the institutional continuity of government represented more modern approaches to state power and governance. Thus, Henry died at the turn of two eras. He was the last English king to truly wield medieval, almost absolute power, but at the same time, he was a monarch who pioneered the bureaucratic state apparatus that would shape the future of government. Ultimately, Henry VIII's death is so compelling and memorable not only because of its gruesome physical details or enormous political significance, but also because it reveals the harsh and undeniable nature of human existence itself. A king who dominated his era through the power of his personality, whose presence overshadowed all others, ended his life facing the same fundamental limitations as the humblest of his subjects. Contemporary sources testify with grim accuracy that in the last days of his life, Henry experienced moments of existential horror, standing before the court not as a king, but simply as a man. As the Archbishop of Canterbury reportedly reminded him as he administered his last rites, "You are about to find yourself where titles mean nothing, and earthly power cannot protect you." In this final extreme vulnerability, perhaps the most infamous king of England, in his agony, achieved a deep connection with his subjects that had tragically eluded him throughout his terrible surviving wives and children in an incredibly difficult position, requiring extreme caution and skillful maneuvering in the ruthless politics of the court. His widow, Catherine Parr, maintained her dignity in public mourning, but in private she quickly remarried her true love, Thomas Seymour, a union she had postponed during Henry's lifetime. 9-year-old Edward, now king in name but under the strict control of his Seymour uncles, recorded his father's death in his diary with a disturbing, almost icy dispassion. The emperor's ambassador received orders to return home on January 4th, after the death of the king, my father, whose soul has been forgiven. This formal, dispassionate entry testifies to the extremely limited personal relationship between father and son, overshadowed by the weight of the crown. Meanwhile, Henry's daughters faced their own unique challenges under the new regime. 31-year-old Mary remained a devout Catholic, increasingly alienated from Edward's radical Protestant reforms. Elizabeth, who was only 13, had to behave with extreme caution at court, as her position was extremely vulnerable due to her mother's execution and unresolved questions about her legitimacy. Despite all the obstacles, both princesses eventually inherited the throne promised to them by Henry, but their path was fraught with danger. Mary narrowly escaped execution during the Wyatt Rebellion, and Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower during her sister's reign. Accounts of Henry's final agonizing hours show how extraordinary, almost complete isolation even the most powerful monarch was surrounded by at the moment of his death. Although he was surrounded by doctors, servants, and courtiers, contemporary sources indicate that Henry met his death in complete solitude, separated from others by both his incomparable royal status and the unique, personal, and indescribable nature of his death itself. Archbishop Cranmer, who attempted to offer spiritual support, reportedly received nothing but a final, meaningful squeeze of the hand. The king, who throughout his reign demanded absolute obedience in his kingdom, whose word was law, ultimately passed away alone, a bitter and terrifying reminder of the great equalizing power of death. The year following Henry's death vividly demonstrated how much his unique personality had dominated the English government. Administrative documents testify to the enormous number of decisions that awaited his personal attention, many of which concerned matters that could easily have been resolved by subordinates, but were regularly referred to the king for consideration due to the widespread culture of extreme subservience that Henry had cultivated. During Edward's regency, government processes were forced to reorganize in order to function without the king's direct personal involvement. This transition, though chaotic at first, ultimately strengthened institutional governance by creating a bureaucratic system that could function independently of the monarch's personal attention and whims. Henry's solemn funeral procession was his last, carefully staged appearance in the public arena of English power. Contemporary sources describe horses draped in black velvet, heralds with ceremonial weapons, and a wax figure of the king in full regalia on the coffin, an artificial body coldly replacing the decomposing natural one hidden beneath. This mournful procession made its way from London to Windsor over several days, allowing thousands of subjects to witness this last solemn display of Tudor grandeur. The carefully choreographed procession reflected deep anxiety about political change, using ritual to reinforce the crucial message that the king might die, but the monarchy as an institution would remain. The court physicians, who had so spectacularly failed to save the king, faced an uncertain future in the dangerous aftermath of the event. Medical records show that some quickly found new employment with other noble families, while others were professionally ostracized for their involvement in Henry's failed treatment. Dr. Thomas Wendy, known for his courage in informing Henry of his imminent death, when others dared not do so, used this display of bravery to continue his service to King Edward VI. The king's apothecaries were subjected to particularly thorough scrutiny, and the lists of medicines administered during Henry's final illness were carefully examined for possible negligence, or worse, deliberate hastening of death, evidence of the pervasive paranoia at court. Scientific examination of Henry's remains during the reconstruction of the crypt in the 1800s revealed intriguing details about his physical condition at the time of his death. According to reports, workers discovered a huge skeleton matching Henry's known height, with clear signs of severe joint wear, especially in the legs. Modern forensic methods applied to historical medical records suggest that Henry may have reached an extraordinary, almost unimaginable weight of around 400 pounds at the time of his death, with a waist circumference exceeding 50 inches. This extreme degree of obesity, combined with poor circulation in his legs and the horrific open wounds described in contemporary sources, created the perfect conditions for the rapid development of sepsis, which almost certainly contributed to his death. Perhaps most telling about Henry's final days is what they ultimately tell us about the inherent limitations of even absolute power. The king who reshaped the entire religious landscape of England, executed kings and nobles with complete impunity, and built a fleet that would eventually dominate the world's oceans, found himself utterly helpless in the face of the inexorable decline of his own body. Court records describe horrific episodes in which Henry, in a rage, attacked his doctors, demanding that they restore his health by the sole power of royal command. This futile resistance to biological reality reveals the central paradox of absolute monarchy: the inevitable, universal vulnerability of even the most powerful human body to illness, decay, and death. The religious ambiguity of Henry's death created fertile ground for competing versions that served various political purposes. Protestant chroniclers enthusiastically emphasized moments of evangelical clarity on his deathbed, while Catholic writers outside England portrayed the king as tormented by deep regret over his break with Rome. In reality, evidence suggests that Henry maintained his characteristic religious position until the end, firmly accepting himself as the supreme head of the English Church and categorically rejecting key doctrines of Protestantism. This complex theological position, essentially Catholic in its rites, but defiantly rejecting papal authority, reflected the king's lifelong tendency to reshape institutions to suit his personal needs rather than submit to external norms. The economic consequences of Henry's death extended far beyond court circles and affected the entire kingdom. Financial documents show that the new Regency government inherited a severely depleted treasury and a devalued currency, which was a direct result of Henry's costly foreign wars and his incredibly extravagant personal spending. According to some estimates, Henry spent the equivalent of $200 million in modern terms on palaces alone during his reign, which is a staggering figure. This financial crisis forced Edward Seymour to continue Henry's controversial policy of selling monastery lands, accelerating one of the largest transfers of property in English history. The economic consequences of Henry's colossal extravagance directly contributed to inflation and social unrest throughout the reign of his children. Henry's profound physical decline served as a powerful and frightening metaphor for contemporary observers, many of whom viewed the king's body as a symbol of the nation itself. Just as medieval political theory presented the monarch as the head of the body politic, Tudor writers interpreted Henry's decaying body as a symbol of deeper corruption in the kingdom. Surviving sermons from 1547 are shocking in their explicit parallels between the king's infected legs and the supposed moral decay of English society. A powerful and disturbing image. This symbolic interpretation gained significant political utility during Edward's reign, when reformers argued that, just as Henry's body required radical intervention, England's religious rituals were in desperate need of purification. Were the personal items found in the king's chambers after his death, which offered a glimpse behind the grim facade of his life. Among the expected attributes of royal power, precious daggers, official seals, diplomatic correspondence, servants discovered a small locked chest containing more personal items. Inside were a miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of hair believed to have belonged to his mother, Elizabeth of York, and a child's handwritten prayer book, possibly belonging to Elizabeth before her mother's execution. These humanizing details offer a fleeting and fragile glimpse of the man behind the monstrous reputation, and suggest that, even as his body and mind were breaking down, Henry retained a fragile connection to his family and personal feelings. The king's death triggered immediate political upheaval that would shape England's destiny for decades to come. Conservative Catholic forces, which had retained a shaky influence in Henry's final years, were sidelined when Edward Seymour, the new powerful Lord Protector, established a resolutely Protestant regency. Archbishop Cranmer, who had administered last rites to the dying king, now accelerated the religious reforms that Henry himself had approached with much greater caution. The first English Book of Common Prayer was published just 2 years after Henry's death, bringing England closer to Protestant doctrine than the king himself had ever intended. Henry's complex religious position, breaking with Rome but stubbornly retaining many Catholic customs, created a deeply ambiguous legacy that allowed both Protestants and Catholics to claim him as their own. Protestant reformers emphasized his rejection of papal authority, while Catholics pointed to his defense of transubstantiation and opposition to Lutheran theology. This theological ambiguity fueled fierce religious conflicts throughout the reigns of all three of his children, as England vacillated between radical Protestantism under Edward, Catholic restoration under Mary, and finally the unstable middle way established by Elizabeth. The king's death also marked an important turning point in Tudor propaganda. Having carefully crafted an image of Henry as a formidable defender of England against foreign threats and papal tyranny, royal propagandists now faced the daunting task of transferring this enormous power to a 9-year-old boy king. Portraits of the young Edward VI deliberately replicated his father's iconic pose, depicting the child with the same wide stance and defiant expression that characterized Henry's most famous and imposing portraits. At court ceremonies, continuity was carefully emphasized. Courtiers were required to bow to Edward's empty throne with the same reverence they had shown his formidable father. Outside the immediate political sphere, Henry's death had a profound impact on the daily life of the whole of England. For almost 4 decades, he had been the embodiment of royal power, his formidable personality and unpredictable whims directly influencing the running of the country down to the lowest level. His death created a profound psychological vacuum, no less significant than the political one. Parish records from early 1547 testify to widespread anxiety about the future, with an increase in reports of prophetic dreams, strange celestial omens, and even alleged ghostly apparitions. For a population steeped in religious symbolism, the death of such a dominant and transformative king inevitably had apocalyptic overtones, casting an atmosphere of unease over the entire nation. The international reaction to Henry's death demonstrated the complex and often contradictory position that England now occupied on the European stage. The French ambassador reported that King Francis I sincerely mourned his dear brother from England, despite their numerous conflicts, which testified to Henry's personal authority. Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, took a more pragmatic view of the strategic implications, wondering whether England, now under the rule of a young king, would be vulnerable to invasion or a new alliance. Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry from the Church 10 years earlier, reportedly celebrated Mass for the king's soul, an unexpected diplomatic gesture that recognized Henry's profound historical significance while subtly affirming the Catholic Church's claim to his spiritual legacy. The place where Henry died, his private chambers in Whitehall Palace, almost immediately took on historical significance. Court officials reported a clear reluctance to enter the rooms where the king had suffered his final agony, and widespread rumors of strange sounds and inexplicable cold spots fueled superstitious fears. The young Edward VI himself reportedly refused to sleep in his father's bed, insisting on new quarters being prepared, which clearly demonstrated the psychological impact. This profound impact reflects the traumatic experience of Henry's decline on those who witnessed it, many of whom had devoted their entire lives to anticipating and satisfying his unpredictable and terrifying demands. Henry's medical case is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of the death of a royal figure in history, providing invaluable information about medical practices during the Tudor era. His doctors kept meticulous records of the treatment administered during the last months of his life, which have been preserved as evidence that everything possible was done to save the king. These documents reveal a fascinating, though ultimately futile approach that combined ancient Galenic medicine with new methods of the Renaissance. Hot banks were used to draw out harmful fluids. Herbal mixtures were prepared based on classical texts, and even early forms of hydrotherapy were tried. The complete ineffectiveness of these methods clearly demonstrates the profound limitations faced even by the most advanced physicians of the time. The king's obsession with his posthumous image was evident in his explicit, grandiose instructions regarding his tomb, a huge monument that would eclipse all other royal tombs in England. Henry commissioned elaborate designs featuring 40 life-size bronze figures and a tall central structure crowned with an equestrian statue of the king himself. This grandiose plan reflected both his colossal ego and his deep-seated anxiety about how history would ultimately judge him. Ironically, this ambitious project remained unfinished due to chronic financial difficulties, and the planned bronze figures were eventually melted down during the English Civil War, which would undoubtedly have infuriated the king, who was so concerned about his image. Immediately after Henry's death, a frantic race began to either secure his enormous legacy or distance oneself from it. Courtiers who had fallen out of favor during the paranoid final years of his life cautiously emerged from hiding, while those who had enjoyed his patronage desperately sought to establish new protective relationships with the new powers that be. The archives contain truly touching letters from royal servants who, after decades of loyal service to the king, suddenly found themselves out of a job. For many, adaptation proved impossible. The highly specialized skills required to manage Henry's explosive temperament were virtually useless in the more restrained and calculating court of the young Edward VI. Tragically, some former favorites, unable to cope with the rapid and treacherous changes in power, committed suicide in the first months after the king's death. Perhaps the most significant event was Henry's death, which marked the beginning of a transitional period in the English state. From the rule of an absolutist monarch, whose personal will dictated all policy, England began to move toward more collegial forms of power-sharing between the crown and the nobility. Edward Seymour, as Lord Protector, clearly did not have the same impressive authority as Henry, and was forced to rely more on the approval of the council. This fundamental shift, although temporarily reversed during the reign of Mary, set powerful precedents for the limitation of royal power, which were further developed under Elizabeth, and ultimately contributed to England's unique constitutional evolution. Thus, Henry's death paradoxically weakened the very institution of absolute monarchy that he had spent his entire life strengthening and defending. The king's final illness became the subject of intense medical retrospectives, with each successive generation of doctors reinterpreting his symptoms in accordance with contemporary beliefs. Victorian doctors, influenced by moral ideas about disease, emphasized syphilis as a likely cause, viewing Henry's condition as divine punishment for his infamous sexual excesses. Early 20th century specialists focused more on metabolic disorders, suggesting that gout and diabetes were the main culprits. Modern medical historians continue to offer even more complex diagnoses, including McLeod syndrome and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, resulting from injuries sustained in jousting tournaments. The careful disposal of Henry's personal belongings provides a vivid insight into the Tudors' attitude towards death and memory. Court inventories meticulously document how items touched by the king in his final days were treated with special reverence, some of them preserved as quasi-relics, despite the official rejection of such practices by Protestantism. His last set of nightclothes, stained with bodily fluids, was solemnly burned under Cranmer's supervision, an act that combined practical sanitation with deep symbolic meaning. More valuable items, including his extensive collection of astronomical instruments and maps, were carefully catalogued and then distributed according to his will or preserved for Edward's education. Access to the royal bedchamber was strictly controlled by Henry's most trusted adviser, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. This obsessive secrecy had a vital practical purpose that went far beyond mere respect for dignity. News of the king's imminent death could have triggered a premature power struggle, chaos, or even foreign invasion, plunging England into catastrophic instability. Cranmer, with his iron will, ensured that only the most essential servants were allowed into the room, and each of them was sworn to absolute terrifying silence about the monarch's true condition. Even Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and only surviving wife, was kept at a distance at certain critical moments, isolated from her dying husband by the harsh demands of the state. In late January and early February, the king alternated between unconsciousness and regaining consciousness, his life hanging by a thread. During brief periods of lucidity, Henry reportedly expressed a growing deep fear of the impending judgment of God. The man who had executed 2 wives, countless nobles, and thousands of commoners without a shadow of regret, now looked with growing horror into the eyes of his own mortality. According to the diary of one of his servants, the king muttered prayers and asked for forgiveness in his sleep, a touching, humanizing detail that stands in stark contrast to the image of the ruthless autocrat who reshaped the religious landscape of England with brutal force of will. Court records from those final days attest to the extraordinary, almost unimaginable measures taken to preserve what little dignity the king had left. As his bodily functions failed catastrophically, teams of servants worked in shifts around the clock, performing increasingly repulsive and grotesque tasks to clean and move the king's enormous body. The sores on his legs became so severe that, as already mentioned, the bones were visible through the necrotic tissue. The stench became so unbearable and pervasive that perfumed handkerchiefs became an essential accessory for anyone brave enough to enter the king's chamber. Despite the bitter winter cold, The windows were thrown open whenever the king lost consciousness, in a desperate attempt to ventilate the putrid air. By February 27th, even in the most cynical circles of the court, it was no longer possible to maintain the carefully constructed appearance that the king might recover. Archbishop Cranmer was urgently summoned to the king's bedside, as Henry's breathing became increasingly labored and intermittent, and he struggled to breathe. Contemporary sources describe a truly touching scene. The king, no longer able to speak, was asked to squeeze Cranmer's hand if he believed in Christ, and not in the religious rites he had once held so dear. Henry, summoning his last strength, squeezed Cranmer's hand, then fell into a final, irreversible coma. This touching detail is often cited by Protestant historians as compelling evidence of his conversion on his deathbed, the final conversion of his soul to mercy. The king died before dawn on January 28, 1547. Even after his death, Henry's enormous physical presence continued to dominate the royal bedchamber, and his corpse was a grotesque, monumental testimony to a life of excess and unimaginable suffering. The official cause of death was simply natural decay, which was a euphemism for the horrific reality. However, modern medical analysis, drawing on centuries of advances, points to a deadly combination of heart failure, sepsis from infected wounds, and severe complications likely caused by type 2 diabetes. Perhaps more remarkable than the death itself was the extraordinary conspiracy of silence that followed immediately after it. A secret council, acting with frightening precision, concealed the news of the king's death for 3 days. This delay was not accidental. It proved absolutely crucial in ensuring a smooth and strictly controlled transition of power. While Henry's huge body lay cold in his chambers, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, and uncle of the new king, acted with ruthless efficiency to secure complete control. Secret meetings were held, key fortresses throughout the kingdom were placed under guard, and potential rivals were neutralized with preemptive strikes, all before Henry's death was publicly announced on January 31st. When, 3 days after the monarch's actual death, the bells rang out in London, Edward Seymour had already been proclaimed Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, and was effectively ruling England on behalf of his young nephew. The disposal of Henry's remains was a unique and truly gruesome task, which provided a glimpse into the funeral rites of the Tudor dynasty, and revealed the horrific physical condition of the king at the time of his death. Court records indicate that the royal corpse began to decompose at an alarming rate, almost certainly due to advanced infections already raging in his body. Embalmers worked tirelessly, racing against time to prepare the body by removing the internal organs and filling the cavities with fragrant herbs and preservatives. According to reports, even these experienced specialists were shocked by the condition of Henry's internal organs, especially his diseased liver and swollen heart, which were signs of years of abuse and illness. Henry's coffin, custom-made, had to be built to accommodate his enormous size, which was reported to be almost twice the width of a standard coffin for a nobleman. Its enormous weight required the reinforcement of the hearse and additional pallbearers for transportation. During the funeral ceremony at Whitehall, witnesses recorded a truly horrific detail. The lead-lined coffin actually split open under the pressure of gases that had built up in the rapidly decomposing body. This led to fluid leaking onto the floor of the chapel, a grotesque final humiliation for a king who was so obsessed with grandeur and power. Almost unbelievable accounts suggest that dogs, attracted by the stench, licked the leak, a truly grim and undignified end for a man who demanded absolute reverence. The funeral procession to Windsor Castle on February 16th provided the nascent Tudor regime with one last grand opportunity to demonstrate Henry's enduring power even after his death. Black horses pulled the massive coffin through streets lined with mourners, while elaborate figures depicted the king in his prime, a handsome, energetic monarch, rather than the bloated, sick man he had become. In St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, Henry was finally buried next to Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him a son and heir, and the only one who escaped the king's disfavor, dying of complications during childbirth before Henry's love for her had time to fade. The physical reality of Henry's decomposing body, rotting beneath the stone floor of Windsor, stood in stark contrast to the carefully constructed myth of his reign that was already being created. Court artists such as Hans Holbein carefully crafted an image of Henry as a broad-shouldered embodiment of masculine strength, with his feet firmly planted, his hands on his hips, and a defiant gaze fixed on the viewer. This carefully constructed propaganda, a powerful illusion, bore little resemblance to the disease-ridden body now sealed beneath the earth, but it became the definitive image of Henry VIII in the popular imagination for centuries to come. Henry's will, a carefully drafted document of 30 pages, revealed his last desperate attempts to control the future from beyond the grave. It carefully spelled out the succession. First Edward, then Mary, the daughter of his first wife Catherine of Aragon, and finally Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. This clear line of succession, although interrupted by the 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, was ultimately followed exactly as Henry had wished. The king's posthumous influence on England continued through all 3 of his children, each of whom ruled as a monarch of the Tudor dynasty, until the dynasty ended with the death of Elizabeth in 1603. More significant was the distribution of power established by Henry for Edward until he came of age. The king, always suspicious, created a regency council of 16 men who were to govern the country collectively until Edward reached the age of 18. This seemingly balanced approach reflected Henry's deep distrust of any individual nobleman who might gain too much influence over his son. However, his careful plan was almost immediately thwarted. Edward Seymour, with remarkable speed and cunning, outmaneuvered his colleagues and was appointed Lord Protector just a few days after Henry's death. The speed with which Henry's wishes were violated demonstrated the cruel limitations of even royal power once death had removed his formidable and intimidating presence. The medical legacy of Henry's final days continues to fascinate both historians and doctors. His symptoms have been retrospectively diagnosed as signs of everything from syphilis to scurvy, although the most compelling evidence points to type 2 diabetes complicated by chronic osteomyelitis. Some modern medical historians have even suggested more complex diagnoses, including McLeod's syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that could explain both his physical deterioration and psychological changes, as well as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, caused by numerous injuries sustained in his youth during jousting tournaments. His medical records show increasingly desperate and bizarre treatments, ranging from the use of live pigeons cut in half and placed on his festering wounds to experimental mixtures of gold and crushed precious stones. These expensive but completely useless treatments reflect both the extreme limitations of Tudor-era medicine and the extraordinary, almost unimaginable measures taken in the case of a patient with Henry's was heavy with the smell of decay, a stench that clung to the silk curtains and velvet draperies despite desperate attempts to rid it with scented handkerchiefs and burning incense. It was not merely the smell of disease, it was the smell of the king's agonizing death, the terrifying final act for a man who had once embodied the very power of England. Imagine, if you can, this chilling paradox. Henry VIII, the great monarch, whose will reshaped the nation, and whose formidable voice struck terror across the continent, had now been reduced to a monstrous, motionless figure, his once majestic body a rotting prison, his broken mind a bleak landscape inhabited by the ghosts of his own cruelty. Such was the terrifying reality of January 1547, when whispers of "the lion is dying" spread through the court, although his claws, as the courtiers well knew, remained dangerous until the very end. The path to this grotesque finale was not a sudden fall, but a long descent that transformed a handsome, athletic prince, celebrated throughout Europe for his vitality and charm, into a tyrannical figure suffocating in the candlelit chambers of Whitehall? The answer lay not only in his infamous string of marriages and desperate search for an heir, but also in a series of medical disasters that mercilessly changed his body and mind beyond recognition. By January 1547, the once recognizable king who had fought the best knights in the Christian world was a mere shadow of his former self. His body had become a veritable battlefield with disease. His legs were covered with festering ulcers that emitted such an unbearable stench that courtiers struggled to suppress their nausea in his presence. According to some accounts, the bones were visible through the necrotic tissue of these terrible wounds, indicating the advanced state of his decomposition. This enormous body, which according to some accounts weighed about 450 pounds and required mechanical devices to move, was no longer a symbol of power, but a monument to suffering. His once handsome face was now distorted and swollen, his eyes sunken deep into his skin, which had taken on a sickly yellow hue. His royal physicians, some of the most learned men of their time, were completely helpless. Their limited arsenal of remedies, bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and desperate prayers, proving powerless against the destructive cocktail of diseases consuming their master. Looking back through the lens of modern medical science, most historians believe that Henry suffered from type 2 diabetes, gout, and possibly osteomyelitis, a painful bone infection that could explain the chronic, excruciating pain in his legs. Even more alarming was the profound deterioration of the king's mental state. His legendary explosive temper, always unstable, escalated into fits of rage, followed by periods of confused lethargy. Even as the shadow of death lengthened over him, the ruthless politics of succession engulfed the royal court. When his third wife, Jane Seymour, finally gave birth to a weak 9-year-old heir, Edward, influential factions were already positioning themselves to seize control of the boy and thus of England after Henry's inevitable death. The conservative Catholic faction, led by the shrewd Duke of Norfolk, found itself embroiled in a ruthless struggle with the reformist Protestants, led by Edward Seymour, the young prince's uncle. Henry, consumed by paranoia until his last breath, was well aware of these complex intrigues and, according to reports, signed execution orders even when he could barely hold a pen in his hands. The rapid deterioration of the king's health remained one of the most closely guarded secrets in the entire kingdom, a dangerous truth concealed by royal decree. In official proclamations, Henry was still brazenly described as healthy and vigorous, a grotesque lie that mocked the grim reality within the palace walls. The few who were allowed to enter the king's bedroom were met with a truly horrific sight. The huge royal bed draped in dark funeral cloths, the sickly sweet smell of decay barely masked by clouds of burning incense. In the center lay the enormous figure of a man who had once been the embodiment of England's power. The palace servants, frightened and cowering, whispered that they could hear the king's cries echoing through the cold stone corridors of Whitehall. The sores on his legs caused him such excruciating pain that even the slightest movement sent waves of agony coursing through his enormous body. His doctors, desperate and increasingly frantic, applied poultices containing everything from boiled onions to powdered human skulls. Desperate, useless remedies that only intensified his suffering. Much more effective, though equally insidious, was the liberal use of opium, which dulled the king's pain but further clouded his already fading mind, blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. The psychological torment was no less, and perhaps even greater than the physical. Once, Henry was the most feared man in England. His word literally meant life or death for any of his subjects. Now he was completely helpless, betrayed by his own body. Court records paint a frightening picture of increasingly erratic behavior. Moments when he fell into a delirious state, babbling incoherently about the ghosts of executed rivals, or calling out to long-dead wives. However, during clearer moments, the king obsessively revised his will, driven by a fierce determination to control the future of his dynasty, even after his death. Contemporaries noted with deep concern how the king's religious views changed dramatically in the last days of his life. It is well known that Henry broke with Rome and proclaimed himself head of the Anglican Church, but now he seemed to be tormented by spiritual doubts, like a soul stuck between two worlds. One day he demanded Catholic rights, the next he reaffirmed Protestant principles, and his inner struggle reflected the religious upheavals he had caused in his kingdom. His personal chaplain recorded harrowing accounts of how the king would wake in terror from nightmares, claiming to see the faces of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and countless other victims of his reign standing silently at his bedside in silent condemnation. This personal hell mirrored the public anxiety caused by his unique religious position. Essentially a Catholic in ritual, but defiantly rejecting papal authority, he occupied a complex theological position that, after his death, became the cause of decades of conflict. The king's death did not simply create a power vacuum, but also sparked a dangerous struggle for power among his courtiers, each of whom was desperate to secure a favorable position in the upcoming regency. The Privy Council, a body composed of influential individuals, split into rival factions, maneuvering with ruthless precision. Thomas Howard, the cunning Duke of Norfolk, who had survived decades of court intrigue, eventually found himself in a losing position due to the maneuvers of the growing Protestant faction. In the final, chilling manifestation of Henry's unyielding cruelty, Norfolk was sentenced to death for treason on behalf of the dying king. In a macabre twist of fate, he ultimately survived only because Henry died before the sentence could be carried out, demonstrating the king's absolute and unshakable power even in the last moments of his life. January 27, 1547, marked the irreversible beginning of Henry's final decline. Witnesses reported that the king suffered such a severe attack that his servants were forced to physically restrain him to prevent him from injuring himself. When the terrible attack passed, Henry struggled to speak. His right side was partially paralyzed. Clear and irrefutable evidence of what modern medicine would immediately diagnose as a massive stroke. The court physicians, well aware that if they failed to save the king, they would face disgrace, imprisonment, or even execution, desperately tried to revive their patient. They pressed red-hot irons against his skin in an attempt to draw out harmful fluids and forcibly poured bitter medicinal concoctions down his throat, painful remedies born of ignorance and desperation.